Welcome to Guilty Pleasure Stories channel. We hope you'll have fun with us. Enjoy watching. It was a cold autumn evening when my world fell apart. My husband, whom I had shared my life with for over the decades, confessed to infidelity. He spoke the words with a kind of detached remorse, as though he were commenting on the weather, not shattering my trust into a 999 irreparable pieces. I sat there in stunned silence, gripping the edge. Didn't a dagger, each one carving deeper into the foundation of my life. When he finally left the house, his departure felt less like a storm blowing through and more like the silence that follows. Eerily calm but heavy with devastation for a long while. I couldn't move. It was as though my body had turned to stone, as if reacting physically to the weight of what had just transpired. Then I heard footsteps descending the staircase. My son Arthur was standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. I hadn't even thought of how much he might have overheard Mom. His voice was soft, but steady. "Is it true?" I could not bear to meet his eyes. "Yes, it's true." He moved across the room in quick, decisive steps and wrapped his arms around me. Arthur, my 18-year-old boy. No young man was holding me as though he were the parent now, and I was the child. His embrace was warm grounding, and for the first time that evening I allowed myself to cry. The days that followed were a haze of anger, hurt, and uncertainty. My husband, ex-husband, as he would soon become, stayed elsewhere, leaving the house eerily quiet. Arthur took it upon himself to fill the void, stepping up in ways I never anticipated. He prepared meals, reminded me to eat, and made sure I didn't retreat entirely into myself. "Mom," he said one evening over dinner, his voice calm but insistent. "You have to stop blaming yourself. This is not your fault." "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. Maybe if I'd been more present, more attentive. He cut me off.
"Stop it."
"Dad made his choices. This isn't about what you did or didn't do." His words brought me to tears again, but this time they were tears of relief. In that moment, I realized Arthur wasn't just supporting me out of duty, he genuinely believed in me. His strength gave me permission to start believing in myself again. As the weeks turned into months, Afrin and I developed a rhythm that felt almost like rebuilding. We started spending evenings together, watching old movies we both loved or playing cards at the kitchen table. Slowly but surely laughter returned to the house, not the carefree laughter of before, but something deeper born of survival and understanding. After the betrayal, Arthur and I became closer in ways I hadn't anticipated. His presence was a balm steady and grounding in the aftermath of my husband's departure. We spent hours talking late into the night, our conversations ranging from shared memories to dreams for the future. At first, these talks were a comfort, a way to keep the silence and loneliness at bay. But as time passed, the dynamic between us began to shift in subtle, unsettling ways. I first noticed it during one of our late-night movie marathons. Arthur had made popcorn, and we sat together on the couch, the glow of the television casting flickering shadows across the room. It was a light-hearted film, but I found myself distracted by his presence the way he leaned closer during a funny scene, his laughter rich and genuine, the warmth of his arm brushing against mine. All of it stirred something within me, something I couldn't name. I dismissed the feeling, brushing it off as gratitude for his unwavering support. But the next day, when I caught him looking at me across the breakfast table, his gaze lingering just a moment too long, my heart skipped in a way I couldn't ignore. One evening, as I sorted through old family albums, Arthur joined me, his presence familiar and comforting. We sat on the living room floor, flipping through photographs and sharing stories. I felt at ease, laughing at his commentary about the terrible hairstyles and questionable fashion choices immortalized in the pictures. Then he pulled out a photo of me and stared at it for a moment. His expression thoughtful. "You were so beautiful," he said, softly glancing at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. I tried to laugh it off. "That was a long time ago." He shook his head, his eyes not leaving mine. "You still are." The room seemed to grow quieter, the air heavier. I felt a warmth rise to my cheeks, and I quickly turned my attention back to the album, pretending to search for another photo. But the moment lingered, his words echoing in my mind long after we'd moved on. As the days turned into weeks, these moments became more frequent, a touch that lingered, a glance that held too much meaning, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me. I began to notice him in ways I hadn't before, and the realization terrified me. He was my son, my anchor during the most tumultuous period of my life. How could I even entertain these feelings? One evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, Arthur reached for a dish. At the same time, I did, his hand brushing mine. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I froze, my heart racing. He didn't pull away immediately, his fingers curling around mine briefly before letting go. "Sorry," he murmured, his voice low. But when I looked at him, there was something in his eyes that said he wasn't sorry at all. I felt unsteady, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. I excused myself and retreated to my bedroom, shutting the door behind me as though it could keep out the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of his touch, the way it had made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. The next day I avoided him as much as I could, burying myself in chores and errands. But that evening, as I sat on the porch trying to clear my mind, Arthur joined me. He sat beside me close enough that our shoulders almost touched, and we watched the stars in silence. "Mom," he said after a while, his voice hesitant, "are you okay?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "You've been distant," he continued, his tone gentle. "Did I do something wrong?" I turned to look at him, my heart aching at the concern in his eyes. "No, of course not. I've just had a lot on my mind." He nodded, his gaze searching mine. "You can talk to me, about anything." There was something in his voice, a quiet sincerity that made my defenses crumble. I know I whispered for a long moment. We just sat there, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. Then he reached out and took my hand, his touch warm and steady. I should have pulled away, but I didn't. Instead, I let him hold it, my heart pounding as I felt the boundaries between a blur even further. In the days that followed, I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but it was a fragile facade. The tension between us was palpable and undercurrent in every interaction. I told myself that these feelings were wrong, that they had to be. IGN had shifted between us, and there was no going back. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, Arthur turned to me, his expression serious moat. He began, his voice soft but firm. "I know this is complicated, but I need you to know that you're everything to me, and I don't just mean as my mom." I felt my breath catch his words, both terrifying and thrilling. "Arthur, we can't," I know, he interrupted gently. "I know how it sounds, but I can't pretend I don't feel this way." Tears welled up in my eyes, and I shook my head. "This isn't right, maybe not," he said. His voice filled with quiet determination, "but it's real." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, and in that moment I realized that we had crossed a line that neither of us could uncross. It was a quiet morning. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window as I flipped pancakes, the scent of coffee filling the air. Arthur walked in shirt, rumpled from sleep, his hair a told mess. He looked so much like the boy I remembered, so familiar. "So mine, I've been thinking," he said, sitting down at the table and pouring himself a cup of coffee. His tone was casual, but the weight in his voice gave him away about what I asked, keeping my back to him as I played the pancakes. I could feel his eyes on me, their intensity, a constant presence lately. "College," he replied. After a beat, "I don't think I want to go." That made me pause. I turned to face him, setting the plate on the table between us. "What do you mean? You've worked so hard for this." He shrugged, playing with the edge of his napkin. "I just think it's not for me. Maybe I can stay here, find a job, help out around the house. The words sent a strange shiver through me. I sat down across from him, my heart sinking as I realized this wasn't a whim. There was a determination in his voice, a quiet certainty. "Arthur, you don't have to do that. You've earned the right to chase your dreams," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What if this is my dream?" He asked, his gaze steady and unflinching. "To stay here, to be with you." We didn't talk much for the rest of the day. His words stayed with me, circling my mind like a storm. I couldn't escape. Was this my fault? Had I leaned on him too much in the wake of his father's betrayal? Was I keeping him from the life he deserved? That evening, as I stood at the sink washing dishes, Arthur came up behind me. I hadn't heard him enter the room, but I felt his presence before he even spoke. "You're mad," he said, his voice low. "I'm not mad," I replied, scrubbing at a plate harder than necessary. "I just don't understand. Why would you give up on everything you've worked for? Because it doesn't feel like giving up?" He said simply, "It feels like choosing what matters." I turned to face him, my hands dripping with soapy water. "Arthur, I'm your mother." This I gestured between us, unsure how to even describe what it was. "This can't be the reason you're staying." His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might walk away, but instead he stepped closer. "It's not the only reason," he said, his voice steady, "but it's part of it, and I'm not going to apologize for that." The intensity in his eyes was overwhelming, and I had to look away. "You're throwing away your future," I murmured. "Maybe I am," he said, "but it's my choice." Days turned into weeks, and Arthur stayed true to his word. He applied for jobs around town, landing a position at a local hardware store. He came home every evening, his hands dirty and his face streaked with sweat, but he looked content, maybe even happy. We settled into a routine that felt too comfortable, too familiar. He'd help with dinner, his hands brushing mine. As we worked side by side in the kitchen, we'd watch movies together on the couch, his arm draped over the back, retest so close that I could feel the heat of his skin, and every so often I'd catch him looking at me with that same quiet intensity that made my heart race and my stomach twist in equal measure. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun set, Arthur broke the silence. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice soft. "Regret what?" I replied, though I knew exactly what he meant. "Not stopping me, letting me stay." I looked at him, his face bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but not because I don't want you here, I don't want you to give up everything for me." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I'm not giving up anything, I'm choosing you, Mom." "Doesn't that mean anything?" "It means everything." I whispered, my throat tight. "But it scares me." "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because I don't know if I'm strong enough to do this." I said the words spilling out before I could stop them, to keep pretending that this is just normal. Arthur reached out his hand, brushing mine. The touch was electric, sending a jolt through me. "Then stop pretending," he said, his voice steady and sure. My breath hitched, and for a moment I couldn't speak. His hand closed around mine, his grip firm but gentle, and I felt myself leaning into him, drawn by a force I couldn't name. "Arthur," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It's okay," he said, his other hand coming up to cup my face. "It's just us, no one else. It's always been just us." The world seemed to fade away, leaving only the three of us on that porch, the air thick with unspoken words and forbidden feelings, and for the first time, I didn't push him away. The moment hung in the air between us, heavy and intoxicating. Arthur's hand lingered on my face, his thumb brushing my cheek so lightly it felt like a whisper. The logical part of my mind screamed at me to stop, to pull away, to set a boundary before it was too late. But another part, the part that had felt so empty and alone for so long, ached to stay in that moment, to let it stretch on forever. "I don't know if we can do this," I whispered, my voice trembling under the weight of my own admission. His gaze held, mine steady and unyielding. "Who decides what we can or can't do? No one knows what we've been through, Mom. No one understands what we have." I shook my head, tears welling up in my eyes. "Arthur, I'm your mother. This isn't how things are supposed to be." He dropped his hand, but didn't move away. "I know how it sounds, I know how it looks, but it doesn't feel wrong." "It never has." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the depth of emotion he was struggling to contain. "You've always been everything to me, even before Dad left. And now it feels like it's just us against the world." His words pierced through me, a mixture of warmth and fear, swirling in my ch***t. "It's not that simple," I said, barely above a whisper. People will talk. They'll never understand. Let them talk, he said fiercely. Let them think whatever they want. They don't know what it's like to be us, to feel this. I turned away, staring out at the horizon where the sun had dipped below the treetops, casting the world in dusky shadows. The world felt too big and too small all at once, and the weight of his words pressed down on me. Arthur, you deserve a normal life. A future with someone who can give you everything you need. I can't be that person, but what if you already are? He asked, his voice filled with quiet desperation. What if I don't want anyone else? The days that followed were tense, the unspoken words between us hanging like a storm cloud. Arthur didn't press me further, but his presence was undeniable, a constant reminder of the line we were dangerously close to crossing. Every shared moment carried a weight that made my heart ache. One evening I found him in the living room, sprawled on the couch with a book in his hands. He looked so at ease, so comfortable in our home. His hair fell into his eyes as he read, and when he glanced up to see me standing in the doorway, a small soft smile spread across his face.
Hey, he said simply. Hey,
I replied, feeling suddenly self-conscious. I hesitated before stepping further into the room, unsure of what to say. You okay? He asked, setting the book aside. I nodded, sitting down on the armchair across from him. Just thinking about us. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge of vulnerability in it. I didn't answer right away, but I could feel his eyes on me waiting. Finally, I nodded. About us. He sat up, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. I'm not trying to push you, Mom. I can't pretend. I don't feel what I feel, and I don't think you can either. I closed my eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. Arthur, this is so complicated. There are rules. Boundaries we're not supposed to cross. Who makes those rules? He asked, his voice soft but insistent. Who decides what's right for us, the world or us? In theming me to confront the truth I had been avoiding for so long, I opened my eyes to find him watching me, his expression open and raw. I'm scared. I admitted I'm scared of what this means, of what we might lose. If we let this go any further. You won't lose me, he said firmly, not ever. You're my whole world, Mom, and I'm yours. His words broke something in me. All the walls I had built, the defenses I had clung to came crashing down. I didn't know if it was right or wrong, but in that moment it didn't matter. All I knew was that I was tired of fighting what felt inevitable. I stood crossing the room to sit beside him on the couch. He looked up at me, his eyes searching mine for permission, for understanding. Slowly, tentatively, I reached out, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. His breath hitched, and I felt the electricity between us spark to life again. Arthur, I whispered, my voice trembling. I'm here, he said softly, his hand coming up to rest against mine. We sat there in the quiet, the unspoken finally acknowledged, and for the first time I let myself lean into him, letting the boundaries we had fought so hard to maintain faded into. My story ends here. If you feel that this story is meaningful and brings useful lessons, please like and subscribe to the channel to support me. Thanks for listening, and see you in the next videos.